Hey, what's going on? I'm Mons, and this is Mons on the Mic, where we uncover all of the chaos that is unfolding in our country. And if you're interested in chaos, check out my book, 20 and Out. It's available on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. So, we are going to go into some serious deep dives into Gabbard's recent release of the files pertaining to Fauci's work overseas in Ukraine in the biolabs. We're going to tie that together with what Hunter was doing in Burisma in Ukraine and what was happening at the Wuhan lab. So stay tuned for that. But considering that next week is the 4th of July, and I am a patriot and I do truly love this country, and I know that there are forces that are working very hard to destroy the fabric of it, I was thinking the other day, and I wanted to point this out. So I thought that maybe it would be a little insightful and helpful to really define the two sides, right? During our founding, there were two opposing sides, one that was for slavery and one that was adamantly opposed to slavery. But somehow, during our founding, in those discussions that created the Constitution, we were able to come together. Our founding fathers were able to come together and form a compromise for the good of creating one nation. As two separate nations, a North and a South, would easily be conquered again by England, and we would be under the control of a tyrant. The question is, do we have that ability now? Are we in a place in America where we can come to some compromise? So I was thinking about this, and we have to really be able to identify each side. So we have some people who firmly believe that our country was fundamentally built on slavery. So therefore, it's inherently evil. So I ask those people, and I mentioned this on a previous podcast, are you equally as angry with the African warlords who captured their fellow Africans, put them in chains, and sold them to European slave traders? Do you recognize that it was America in 1808, almost 60 years before the Civil War, that declared the international slave trade illegal? That America created the nation of Liberia in Africa to return captured slaves to their homeland, with England following suit weeks later and creating the nation of Sierra Leone to do the same. It wasn't the African warlords who said, okay, we need to stop sending our black brothers to slave traders and we need to free all of the ones that we've already captured. That never happened. So then how do you demonize America when America was the one who freed the slaves, and really only 3 to 4% of the kidnapped Africans who were taken out of Africa were brought here? The rest went to South America and islands in the Caribbean. And the first country, again, in the entire world, in the history of mankind, the first country who made slavery illegal was the United States. Then there are those who believe we should have open borders and that we're a nation of immigrants. They have allowed the appeal to emotions, always a very powerful motivator used by manipulative governments to get public support for what they want. There is no country in the entire world that allows anyone to come into their country and set up shop. And there is certainly no country that pays the people who come in unvetted without permission. Yes, this is a country of immigrants, immigrants who came in legally, who went through Ellis Island and other ports of entry to ensure that they didn't bring in diseases, that they could work and support themselves and wouldn't be a drain on society, that they had skills to contribute to society, not drag on it. These people and those people that came, including my ancestors, were grateful to America for opening its arms to them and providing them the opportunity to pursue happiness. They worked hard, they refused handouts, they learned how to speak English, and they did so especially in public. There is nothing more rude or disrespectful, in my opinion, than those who refuse to speak English in public. It's disrespectful to the country that you've chosen to be your home. These people that were immigrants waved American flags. They called America their home. I don't see the illegals that have flooded our country today doing this. They don't wave American flags. They're not embracing our culture and do everything that they can to adopt our ways into their lives. In fact, they do the opposite. They refuse to learn our language and speak it. And it's language, like I said before, which is paramount to creating the identity of a nation. Language and culture. They don't hang flags in front of their homes on the 4th of July. They aren't grateful to be in our nation. They're creating in our beautiful nation the third world hellhole that they came from. They're a drag on our society and they are not contributing to it. And it's these illegals, these criminals that wreak havoc on our streets, they rape and murder the women and little children, that you who support illegal immigration are defending when you go and fight ICE agents. Do you understand that you are being used as a low-level street thug to allow for replacement migration, a plan created by the UN and implemented all over Europe and now America? And its intent is to dilute the indigenous population, destroy the country's identity, and leave those who would fight tyranny busy fighting daily on the streets for their very lives. It's meant as a distraction because the globalists knew that it's those who love and know freedom who will be the ones to fight the tyranny when it comes to their front door. So it is those who will fight that have to be oppressed. Oppressed through violence on their streets, through fear of being called a bigot or a homophobe or an Islamophobe, or take your pick of the isms that people are called, causing them to lose their jobs, their ability to earn a living for their family. Illegal immigration is not allowed in any country in the world, and yet you believe that it should be allowed here. Why? Then we have those who are in support of transgender rights, another dividing line between two groups of people, and which there doesn't seem to be any compromise. Putting aside the entire Ishtar demon god argument, which I spoke about in a previous podcast, if anyone remembers MASH from the early 70s into the early 80s portraying the Korean War, we recall Klinger, the character. He was the guy who tried to get psychologically discharged from the army by wearing women's clothes. Dressing as the opposite sex was considered mental insanity. There's something wrong with you, which is what it is. If we follow that argument to its logical conclusion, then anyone can feel on any day that they are anything. So there is no more reality. There's no more truth. It's what your truth is, which is the point, to blur the lines of what is real and what is fake. That's the end goal. Encourage people to focus on themselves, make themselves happy, and who cares about anything that's actually important, like earning a living, starting a family, becoming self-sufficient, not dependent on government handouts, holding your elected officials responsible, paying attention to what's going on in Washington and overseas. All of that disappears when you begin to focus inward, which is what the powers that be want you to do. That's why that transgender movement was created in the first place. Focus on you. Make yourself happy. The opposite of what Jesus taught. And that brings me to probably the biggest divisive line in America of them all, Christianity and the Christian creation of America. I cannot tell you how many times I see people commenting on social media that America isn't a Christian nation. First, I'd like to point out that none of the founders were Jewish or Muslim. All of the founders believed in some version of Christianity, i.e., they believed in God, a power higher than anyone else. That is actually what the founding of our nation was about, enshrining the rights that God gave to us to ensure no government ever took them away. If you don't believe me, read the Declaration of Independence. Did you know that it was more than just one paragraph? It was a list of 27 reasons why the colonists were opposed to Britain's tyrannical rule over them. And the introduction, as everyone should know by heart, the second paragraph actually reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Creator. They believed in God. In fact, reading the Bible was the reason why schools were created in the colonies. Fisher Ames, who was a founding father and writer of the First Amendment, argued when new books were being introduced into schools that, quote, "Why then, if these new books for children must be retained, should not the Bible regain the place it once held as a school book?" Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the father of free public schools in America, stated, quote, "In contemplating the political institutions of the United States, if we remove the Bible from schools, I lament that we waste so much time and money in punishing crimes and take so little pains to prevent them." The founders believed in teaching the Bible in school and continuing to worship the Lord even in the government. The first act of Congress after Washington was sworn in as president was to walk down the block to St. Paul's Chapel and attend a prayer service as one body. Presidents throughout our history, especially during times of tribulation, called on the populace to fast and pray to the Lord for help, believing, as it says in 2 Chronicles, that if my people humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their evil ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. Sunday prayer service was given weekly at the federal Capitol building, in which politicians, presidents, and residents of D.C. attended. The Supreme Court also held weekly Christian services. There was never meant to be a separation of church and state. The government was not permitted to declare one particular sect of Christianity the official religion of any one state, as Jefferson pointed out to a group of Baptists. But a firm belief in God and the Bible was critical to the success of America, and that is what the Founding Fathers believed. Read George Washington's letters, read John Adams' letters, and even Noah Webster, another founding father you've probably never heard of, stated, quote, "All the miseries and evils which men suffer from, vice, crime, ambition, injustice, oppression, slavery, and war, proceed from their despising or neglecting the precepts contained in the Bible." I encourage everyone watching to do your own research. Find examples, for those of you who don't believe that America was founded on Christianity, find examples of statements made by the founders that condemn the teachings of Christ or that they didn't believe in God. Because there aren't any, but please search anyway and prove me wrong. So we come back to the basic principles of all these points. One side of the aisle believes in truth, honesty, morality in life, integrity, and loyalty, protecting America and the founding. The other side believes that belief in God has to be destroyed, that people shouldn't focus on helping your neighbor or being kind to others, but in doing whatever it takes to make themselves happy. That it's okay to lie to someone else and encourage their mental illness. And in so doing, that makes them a good person. You're now righteous. That only certain laws, those that they agree with, should be enforced, and all others should be ignored. One side agrees with free market capitalism, which is the genius of man to create and invent to make everyone's lives easier, the ability to earn success through hard work. And the other side believes that all people need to be divided into different victim categories, all of which decry the very system that made America the richest nation in history, that pulled more people out of poverty than any other system in the history of the planet. They argue that it is this system that is racist and that the rich people should pay the salaries of the poor so they don't have to work, not realizing that a basic income for all only results in poverty for all. Summing up, one side supports policies that better society, that create one identity, an American identity, which is the greatest in the world. Free market, private property, government out of private business, equality of opportunity. The other side supports policies that divide all Americans into subgroups, fighting amongst each other for the scraps from the rich. A government that controls the market, controls private property, provides for equality of outcome, meaning everyone has the same and no one has the ability to better themselves. If you're a fan of this type of government, please drop me a line at monsonthemic@aol.com. I'd really like to understand why you think that that system will work. And please explain why socialism in every other country in the world failed, but you feel that it's going to work here. So those are the two sides that we have. And my question to you is there a way to find a compromise? Is there even a possibility of finding common ground where we will not be permanently divided as a country like we were prior to the Civil War? Please put your comments below and please keep it clean. Even though I'm a big fan of the F word, I don't think that it's appropriate here because there are kids who watch this program. So let's keep it clean for them and let's have a intelligent discussion instead of name calling. See if you can hold yourself back. So pivoting now, I'd like to go back to 2010 and Operation Lockstep. If you Google Operation Lockstep, Google will tell you that it's a conspiracy theory that the COVID pandemic was planned and coordinated by the globalists, i.e. powerful elites, to impose authoritarian government control and remove civil liberties. Well, where did that crazy idea come from? Well, one of the places is a 2010 Rockefeller Foundation report titled Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. This document laid out 4 possible future scenarios, one of which is titled Lockstep and describes a highly contagious flu pandemic spreading globally and documented what a world of tighter government control and more authoritarian leadership might look like. All of the scenarios in this plan, which I have actually read, are very similar to COVID. It's more focused on control of societies and how that would play out, including the eventual rebellion of citizens whose freedoms are restricted for too long. I think if you're going to go down the COVID as planned route, a better comparison may be Event 201. What is Event 201, or what was it? Event 201 was a high-level pandemic tabletop exercise held on October 18th, 2019, hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security in partnership with, guess who? Your favorite, the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Manhattan. According to their site, quote, the exercise consisted of pre-recorded news broadcasts, live staff briefings, and moderated discussions on specific topics. These issues were carefully designed in a compelling narrative that educated the participants and the audience, end quote. The virus that was used in this simulation, a coronavirus, transfers from bat to pig to human. It's spread through air travel. It talks about a vaccine, which is not yet available during the first year of the pandemic. And, quote, the scenario ends at the 18-month point with 65 million deaths. The pandemic is beginning to slow due to the decreasing number of susceptible people. The pandemic will continue at some rate until there is an effective vaccine or until 80 to 90% of the global population has been exposed, i.e. herd immunity. From that point on, it is likely to be an endemic childhood disease, end quote. After this tabletop exercise was conducted, COVID was leashed onto the public. So you can see two sides of this. You can see that they were doing preventative measures, that a pandemic is in a way inevitable, especially with global travel. And so we need to figure out what the potential scenarios could be and how to handle them so that we're better prepared for the eventual pandemic that is inevitable to happen. Or you can say, wow, this is eerily similar to what actually transpired. And maybe this was just a planned event to see how things would go and to see how the governments could use this situation to obtain more control and restricts people's freedom even more than some governments already had. So now we'll go to Gabbard's document drop. Many of them are heavily redacted. I mean, heavily redacted. But the summary is just what many of us thought that it was. The US funded gain of function research on coronavirus. They funded it through EcoHealth Alliance, which obtains the money through the NIH and the NIAID. NIH is National Health Institute of Health, and the NIAID is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. The Wuhan lab received over 1.5 million taxpayer dollars in funding. So first, the gain of function research. Let's tackle that one. A lot of people argue that gain of function research wasn't happening, that we weren't funding it, and that it was a conspiracy theory. However, emails that were released from Gabbard's document drops show that some researchers were expressing concerns that some of the experiments on coronavirus could increase transmission and pathogenesis of viruses. Now, Dr. Fauci testified that, quote, the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain of function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, end quote. Interesting that he specifically states that location instead of just in general. But again, he's very slippery with his testimony, so pay attention to his wording. The regulatory definition also of gain of function research is very specific. Fauci's reasoning is that the viruses at the Wuhan lab were modified, but that alone doesn't make them gain of function under NIH policy. He says that the research grant funded through the EcoHealth Alliance was intended to study bat coronaviruses to understand which ones might infect humans. NIH concluded before the experiments that the work was not reasonably expected to make the virus more transmissible or more virulent in humans. Therefore, it didn't fall under the gain of function definition. Remember that for later. Finally, one experiment later showed a modified virus caused greater illness in certain lab mice, and EcoHealth failed to report these findings promptly as required, which they had done in the past in previous outbreaks. The fact is, researchers engineered bat coronaviruses, and I'll provide evidence for that later on. The resulting viruses acquired new properties, and some experiments produced viruses that were more infectious or caused more severe disease in lab animals. So that's some questions that Fauci is going to have to answer shortly, as Rand Paul has subpoenaed him to appear and testify. The questions, I assume, are going to be very specific, and Fauci's going to have to do some fancy tap dancing to dodge what the truth is. Second, the timeline. After the SARS outbreak in 2002, the Wuhan lab began extensively studying coronaviruses from bats that could infect the human population. We remember the bat lady, Shi Zhengli. She worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and was the world's leading expert on bat coronaviruses. Peter Daszak, if you remember him, he was the president of EcoHealth Alliance, began working closely with the bat lady in 2004. So NIH provides grants to EcoHealth from 2009 to 2014. In 2014, coronavirus research exploded at Wuhan, and this is the time when the gain of function research is alleged to have occurred. Interestingly, President Biden issued Anthony Fauci a preemptive pardon from federal offenses beginning January 1st, 2014. Specifically in relation to his service as the NIAID director. Hunter Biden was also given a pardon by his father beginning on the same day, January 1st, 2014. In 2014, Hunter had joined the board of Burisma in Ukraine. This pardon covered his foreign business activities, and he had lots of those. Strange that both pardons start the same day of the same year. Why would that be? Well, we need to take a step back and look. So in 2011, Hunter Biden co-founded an investment firm, Rosemont Seneca Technology Partners, which in 2014 invested in Metabiota, a pathogen research firm specializing in pandemic early warning. Metabiota focused on disease surveillance and outbreak forecasting, and it worked in Ukraine. Metabiota also received U.S. government funding for infectious disease surveillance. So Metabiota works as a subcontractor for Black & Veatch, an American defense contractor. Now, B&V was hired by the U.S. Defense Department's Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA. B&V is an American defense contractor with ties to other military agencies as well, and they built secure labs in Ukraine. So the DTRA program is part of a non-proliferation initiative, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. This program's stated goal is to prevent the threat of biological, chemical, and nuclear threats. So who funded Metabiota? DTRA and USAID. And USAID, by the way, does not mean U.S. aid. It stands for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Their stated goal is to provide humanitarian assistance overseas by providing medical care, agricultural assistance, and food and clean water. They also attempt to assist in combating infectious disease. However, since DOGE was created by President Trump, ample evidence has been discovered that shows USAID was funneling tax dollars overseas to promote transgender, LGBTQ, and other woke programs in countries all around the world. There was also Syria aid diversion, so the agency faced scrutiny over allegations that millions of dollars intended for food and medical supplies for Syrian civilians were diverted, leading to hundreds of thousands of meals ending up in the hands of Al Qaeda affiliated fighters. Another major contracting scheme unfolded. A high profile U.S. Department of Justice investigation revealed a decade long bribery scheme involving a USAID contracting officer and corporate executives. The individuals pleaded guilty to manipulating at least 14 prime contracts worth more than $550 million in U.S. taxpayer dollars. So USAID has had a history of misusing taxpayer dollars to pad the pockets of their employees and promote the woke programs that deviate from societal norms that have been the bedrock of society since the beginning of man. And USAID money ended up at the Wuhan lab through EcoHealth Alliance, and USAID money also went to Metabiota through the PREDICT program, which was a global early warning system funded by USAID and led by UC Davis One Health Institute. So saying that again, USAID taxpayer dollars went to Metabiota in Ukraine and EcoHealth Alliance, both of whom were studying infectious diseases. So perhaps we can look at this and say, well, after Ebola and SARS and MERS, these agencies were doing everything they could to stop another worldwide pandemic. The problem is that's not what the evidence is pointing to. Gabbard released documents showing that Fauci knew that COVID came from Wuhan, but actively covered it up using news media to perpetrate the wet market theory. Some people actually still believe in that. And if you Google it, they'll say it's a valid theory for the release of COVID onto the world. Fauci funneled money through NIAID to Wuhan to continue research to make viruses more contagious. And the research that was really dicey and apparently pushed the limits of the gain of function definition began in 2014, coinciding with Fauci's preemptive pardon. Makes you wonder if maybe Biden somehow knew something more than what he was sharing, and that's why he provided Fauci with the pardon. So now back to Hunter. Remember his investment firm that he started in 2011, the Rosemont Seneca Tech Partners? Well, the company that started this firm was Rosemont Seneca Partners. Rosemont Seneca Partners was formed by Hunter Biden, Devin Archer, and Christopher Hines, who is the stepson of former Secretary of State John Kerry. And that was formed in June of 2009. Yes, the same year that good old dad became vice president of the USA. So what is the connection between Burisma, the gas company in Ukraine where Hunter sat on the board earning $50,000 a month, and Metabiota, the firm that Hunter's company provided hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant money to? Well, emails on Hunter Biden's laptop, and remember, this is the laptop that Psaki and every news agency claimed was Russian disinformation. If you think about it, it seemed kind of desperate at the time, right? Like everyone was pushing, no, it's Russian disinformation, don't pay attention to it. Why were they so desperate to discredit that laptop? Well, because all of the evidence for everything is on that laptop. The emails revealed that Hunter Biden introduced Metabiota to officials at Burisma, the Ukrainian gas company, where he was a highly paid board member for a science project involving biolabs in Ukraine. This happened in April of 2014. Also in 2014, the U.S. awarded Metabiota almost $24 million in grant money. Mary Gutierrez, the vice president of Metabiota, emailed Hunter 2 months after Russia annexed Crimea and stated, quote, "As promised, I prepared the attached memo, which provides an overview of Metabiota, our engagement in Ukraine, and how we can potentially leverage our team, networks, and concepts to assert Ukraine's cultural and economic independence from Russia and continued integration into Western society." End quote. So what does that even mean? Well, Russia knew the answer to that question. It just took 6 years and Hunter's laptop to get to the truth for the rest of us. They stated that the U.S. was conducting military biological research close to Russia's border, collecting pathogens and biological samples, and was potentially developing capabilities that violated the Biological Weapons Convention. Russia cited publicly known Defense Department contracts with Metabiota, emails between Hunter Biden, Metabiota, and Burisma, Rosemont Seneca's investment in Metabiota, and documents concerning U.S.-supported biological labs in Ukraine. The UN even chimed in defense of the U.S. and stated that the labs were owned by Ukraine and were focused on biosafety, not creating new diseases. But if you remember last week's podcast, I showed how the UN, the WEF, NATO, and the EU are all working with the US, or they were before Trump, for globalist control. And that's why all of these agencies hate Trump, because he has broken from their playbook. Anyway, back to Ukraine, Burisma, Metabiota, and Wuhan. Let's do a timeline to simplify what I've stated. So we're going to go all the way back to 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. Ukraine becomes its own state. Ukraine inherits Soviet biological research facilities, public health labs, and a large military industrial complex from Russia. The U.S. begins funding programs under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program to help former Soviet states secure dangerous pathogens, and probably to see what the heck the Russians were doing in those labs in the first place. Operation Paperclip, if you remember that. That's when we took Nazi scientists and doctors who were conducting tests in the Jewish camps, and we smuggled them into the U.S. so they can continue their scientific experiments here. Operation Paperclip, Google it. And of course, it's all done under the guise of safety, as it always is. From 2010 to 2013, Burisma founder Zlochevsky comes under investigation in Ukraine over corruption and money laundering. Burisma had been laundering money through offshore accounts and making payments to allies and political leaders for a very long time, allegedly. Metabiota receives U.S. contracts related to biosurveillance and emerging infectious disease during that same time period. So in February of 2014, Ukraine removes President Yanukovych, who flees to Russia. He was pro-Russia, and I surmise provided intel to Russia about talks about Ukraine potentially wanting to join NATO, which if you watch my podcast, you would know NATO is the military arm of the City of London Corporation and is used to unify nations to all fall under one government, a government that Putin wanted no part of. So in March of 2014, Crimea is annexed by Russia. So a month after the former Ukrainian president, who's pro-Russia, flees to Russia and potentially provides them with all the information for this one world government takeover, Russia goes into Crimea and takes them back over. And they say that it's because of the threat of Ukraine integrating with NATO and the EU, and also to secure the naval base there. Annexation guaranteed continued military control and prevented Ukraine from expelling the fleet or leasing the base to Western powers. So that port would have given the ability of NATO, the City of London Corporation, the EU, and the United States all working together to have a launching point for an invasion of Russia. Russia effectively stopped that with the annexation of Crimea. So fighting then begins in eastern Ukraine. In April of 2014, we have the emails discussing Metabiota and Burisma introductions and the science project in Ukraine. In May, Hunter Biden is put on Burisma's board, along with his business partner, Devin Archer, with money being laundered into their accounts, as well as a $50,000. From 2014 to 2016, the Obama administration increases diplomatic and financial support for Ukraine, and Vice President Biden becomes the administration's primary official overseeing Ukraine policy. If you remember, Biden spilled the beans during a Council on Foreign Relations meeting. I played this video in a previous podcast. Yeah, those guys that are affiliated with the Committee of 300, that Council on Foreign Relations. So he spoke at that meeting and he stated in 2016 that he threatened the Ukrainian President Poroshenko, saying the Attorney General Shokin is investigating Burisma for corruption and he needs to be fired or we're not going to give you the $1 billion grant money. So by Biden's own account, Poroshenko fires Shokin after Biden tells him to, and the investigation into Burisma disappears. Ironically, it was the US, the EU, and the IMF that were all calling for Shokin to be removed. Again, the US, the EU, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that were all calling for Shokin, who was investigating money laundering through Burisma, to be removed. And what did they say? They said he wasn't looking into corruption fast enough. The only problem was the next guy who replaced Shokin stopped all investigations into Burisma, which tells us that those three groups were involved in the corruption scheme. Metabiota continues biosurveillance work in Ukraine under U.S.-funded programs. In 2018, The Intercept exposed a leaked grant proposal written by EcoHealth Alliance and submitted to DARPA, who supposedly denied the grant. And what was the EcoHealth Alliance request to create full-length infectious clones of bat coronavirus and insert a proteolytic cleavage site into the virus that would connect better with human cells. They basically wanted to create from coronavirus on that viral body a site, a little site in there that will connect easier to human cells, which means that it would make it more transmissible. In 2018, federal prosecutors began investigating Hunter Biden's taxes and certain foreign business dealings. And in 2019, Trump requests that Ukraine investigate the Bidens because he knows something stinks over there and it's bad. And that was the first impeachment. They went after him because he asked to look into it. October 2020, the laptop is exposed by the New York Post, leading all major news agencies as well as social media companies to immediately label that laptop Russian disinformation. And where did that come from? 51 former intel agency heads and the FBI. But the laptop contained emails exposing all the information that I've just provided to you. Why would the 51 intel heads and the FBI work so fervently to dismiss that laptop? There's only one conclusion you can draw from that, because it exposed the globalist plan. The intel agency heads were all a part of it, and it implicated a former vice president. In February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine and publicly links Hunter Biden, Rosemont Seneca Metabiota, Burisma, Pentagon-funded biological research, and Ukrainian labs. They link all of those things together. They argue that those connections show a U.S. military biological program operating in Ukraine. Now, pause for a second before I connect all of these crazy dots together. Russia invaded Crimea during Obama's presidency. Russia invaded Ukraine during Biden's presidency. Why wouldn't they do any of this when Trump was president the first time? Because Putin's not an idiot. He's a dictator, but he's not a moron. He knows that Obama and Biden act as one. Obama is a part of the globalist plot working with NATO, the UN, the WEF, who all work with the City of London Corporation, who take their orders from the Committee of 300, whose goal is a one world government and control over the masses. Trump does not work with any of these entities, and they know that. Trump wants America first, not America going along with a globalist plot for world dominion. Putin knows this. He cannot allow Ukraine to join NATO because he knows that will be the end game for Russia. Putin's a dictator. A dictator does not allow someone else to control their country. It has long been the plan to divide Russia into 5 separate sections, forever weakening Russia's ability to fight against the one world government plan. This is why these aggressive actions only take place when a president who's working with the City of London Corporation's plan is in power. And that's why the war in Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon. Putin cannot allow Ukraine to join NATO, and the UN and NATO cannot lose Ukraine to Russia. This is a risk game. Now back to Burisma in Ukraine. So we have Victoria Nuland. If you haven't heard of her before, start looking into her. She is the one who created the entire mess in Ukraine. Testified that Ukraine has biological research labs, which basically debunks Psaki and the White House claims that that whole thing was a conspiracy theory, that we have biolabs in Ukraine. And she expressed concern that Russia is going to seize them. So now we're going to connect Wuhan with Ukraine. We need to surmise a little bit here, but when you have overwhelming circumstantial evidence, it's not a far leap to put together all of the puzzle pieces and figure out what the grand 30,000-foot view actually is. Let's imagine each one of these following things has a different role. So you have the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They conduct advanced virus research. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency funds biosurveillance and biodefense research programs. Metabiota collects outbreak data, models disease spread, and analyzes the risk. Ukrainian labs collect samples and conduct surveillance. Burisma Holdings provides funding, logistics, political connects, and local partnerships, and continues to launder money as it had done so well in the past. And now we have Zelensky, who is the lapdog of the Committee of 300 and the City of London Corporation, and takes orders directly from them. And if you don't believe me, look up how often Zelensky meets with King Charles, who is a part of the Committee of 300, and how he met with House Democrats before his meetings with Trump. They tell him what to do, and he does it. So in this scenario, a lab studies dangerous pathogens. Regional labs monitor outbreaks and measure the spread. The biosurveillance company analyzes data, and governments use the info for biodefense planning. Private companies like Burisma, again, provide the funding and plausible deniability. And just thinking here, could it be that maybe somebody in a position who is connected to the federal government and is maybe on the board of a very powerful company in Ukraine, maybe knew that a virus was going to be released, whether maybe targeting Russia or the US or both. And he had this privileged intel and decided to capitalize on what would be millions or billions in potential profits. So he invests in companies that will be needed in the very near future. So now, and again, there's no smoking gun that connects all of this, but let's imagine that perhaps COVID was created to be released in Russia. But the powers that be saw that Trump was potentially a bigger threat than Russia was at the time, since all the lies go back to the USA and Trump was asking the right questions that were going to uncover the lies. He needed to be taken down. And in America, prior to COVID, our economy was churning. Unemployment was at a 50-year low. Stock market was at record highs. Inflation was low. Wage growth was improving. Consumer confidence, which is the driver of the market, was extremely high. Trump had just been acquitted in his first impeachment trial, and the Republicans were unified behind him. He was the leader of a unified Republican Party. Trump was going to win in November of 2020. He was going to win re-election, and he was going to single-handedly destroy the globalist plan with that win. Without America, the globalist plan will fall apart. The money comes from America, the weapons come from America. They needed a president who would give them, and by them I mean the Committee of 300 through NATO, UN, WEF, Council on Foreign Relations, all of these groups. They needed a president who would give them whatever they wanted and wouldn't ask questions about what was going on in Ukraine. So they released a coronavirus. Yes, I do think it was intentional. Absolutely. The timing, along with Event 201, was absolutely perfect. They had a disease. They had the labs to figure out how long it would take to spread. They needed to lock down America so that the mail-in ballots would be the way the majority of the people voted. Historically, it's very well known that paper mail-in ballots are wrought with fraud. Jerry Nadler said this in 2004. James Baker, who co-chaired the 2005 Bipartisan Commission on Federal Election Reform, concluded that absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential fraud. There are at least 4 separate cases in 1982, 1993, 94, and 97 of major fraud involving absentee ballots that resulted in prosecutions and races being overturned by judges. Knowing this, and knowing that most of Americans supported Trump, they had to cheat. They needed a way to control the polling locations. What better way than a deadly virus? The only problem was it wasn't really as deadly as they had hoped, so they needed to hype the disease and put fear into people. Fear is a great motivator for control. So they had every major news organization covering 24/7 COVID numbers. And who is the major shareholder of all the major news organizations? Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And who are the largest shareholders of Pfizer? Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. What about Moderna? Vanguard and BlackRock. And where are their financial hubs? In London. City of London Corporation. It's the financial hub of the world outside of Wall Street. So release a virus onto the world, which will inevitably affect the US. Shut down the economy, which obviously is going to hurt Trump. Shut down companies that don't conform to the ideals of the globalist one world government, which is total control. Mom and pop stores, which are not easily controlled by the globalists, are shut down and they go out of business. Now, approve a vaccine which has no proven efficacy against coronavirus and convince the world it's the only thing that's going to save their lives. Shut down and destroy dissenting opinions who offer evidence of studies that show that ivermectin, a pill that costs 3 cents to make, stops COVID in its tracks. Get rid of the useless old people who are a drain on society by forcing them into nursing homes and onto ventilators. And at the same time, the vaccine that's going into everyone's arms is enriching Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca to the tune of billions of dollars. Pfizer alone made $80 billion from the COVID vaccine. That also enriches their shareholders. There is no informed consent for the vaccine since it was approved on the U.S. Emergency Use Authorization, and the fact sheet that was given lists myocarditis and pericarditis as potential side effects, particularly in young males, which we saw after the fact. In fact, not all of the side effects, though, that we've seen people suffering from came out because the vaccine had never been used before. And it was still being studied. But because mainstream media, false God Fauci, and many others touted the efficacy, people lined up voluntarily and they didn't question the science. The numbers were skewed. People didn't die from COVID, and almost no children died from it. But these facts didn't matter. The panic of the herd, which had been studied for decades by the Committee of 300, by the way, would be enough to motivate people to take the vax, which wasn't a vaccine. What it did was alter people's DNA and RNA. It weakened the immune systems by telling the body to make the most toxic part of the disease, the spike protein, and it never tells the body to stop making it. Immune systems now turn against its own body, causing autoimmune disorders, a steep rise in turbo cancers, and all kinds of other diseases. And this is part of the globalist plan. Sicken the population and get rid of the useless eaters. Klaus Schwab said it himself. He said COVID has presented us with an opportunity for a great reset. The plan has been put into motion and released right on schedule. King Charles also verbally supported the Great Reset as well. The globalists finally stopped hiding behind the curtain because they thought that no one would be able to take them down. And what was the Great Reset? Reform capitalism to a stakeholder model. The free market of supply and demand doesn't dictate what products succeed. It's those who control the companies that dictate what products are going to be put out there. Use recovery spending to invest in green energy, which, as I've gone over before, only creates less electricity for the world, not more, and puts more people into poverty. Mandate companies to conform to ESG standards, which create less successful companies. The Great Reset was the opportunity that globalists had been waiting for 100 years. The ability of the world's elites to reshape the world's economies to benefit the rich and return to the landowner serf class system. A booming American economy with Trump at the wheel would interfere with that plan. They took him down. They put in the idiot Biden, who was already corrupt and bought and paid for, and worked hard to complete their plan. Trump gets elected again, and luckily this time he sees the entire global picture, and he's attacking it, multiple pieces simultaneously. Wuhan, Burisma, and the Biden family are all intertwined with NATO, the UN, the WEF, and the Committee of 300 Globalist plot. So let's put this all together. What we have is we have Hunter Biden on the board of Burisma with a side company funding and providing money to Metabiota that follows diseases and predicts where they're going to go. He introduces people at Burisma with the people at Metabiota, and they want to do a science project in Ukraine. Now, the USAID is funding Metabiota, is also funding research into the Wuhan lab, which is creating a disease that is more easily transmitted to humans. Throughout this entire time, everything that is pointing to these facts was denied. It was called a conspiracy theory, Russian disinformation, you name it, didn't happen, whatever. And later testimony has discovered that no, actually, there are about 40 biolabs in Ukraine that America funds. And you have a president who pardons his son, and the guy who was in charge of funneling all of these monies to the biolab in Wuhan and Ukraine, they both get pardons starting 2014. And it just so happens that it's 2014 where you have the creation of the gain of function research in the Wuhan lab and all of these monies going to fund all of these companies that are going to follow where disease spreads. And Russia knew it all along, and they were doing preemptive moves in a method of self-preservation. Meanwhile, in the US, the major mainstream media companies were saying it's all lies, it's misinformation, and don't pay attention to that. I've said it before. It is about wealth, power, and control. The tools of the devil are used to control people, and they use fear to control you. How you acted in 2020, 2021, and 2022 tells you the type of person you are and how you would act under complete tyranny. If you ever wondered if you have balls of steel, now you know. I refuse the vaccine. I refuse to capitulate to fear. Did you? And if you don't believe me about a new world order and all of the evidence that I provided to you, I'll leave you with this video. George Bush Sr., former head of the CIA, speaking to the American people as president on January 16th, 1991. Let's take a look.
They're back. I'm hopeful that this fighting will not go on for long and that casualties will be held to an absolute minimum. This is an historic moment. We have in this past year made great progress in ending the long era of conflict and Cold War. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders. We have no argument with the people of Iraq. Indeed, for the innocents.
So thanks for watching. Hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed this podcast. I want to give a shout out to Poker Peeps. Thanks so much for your support. I greatly appreciate it. Love you guys. And to Jen up in North Carolina, and to Mike and Jay in New York, and to all my brothers in blue, stay safe out there, and we will see you next time.